Namaste and welcome. Anthony DeMello, many of you might know as a well-known Jesuit priest and writer, wise man. And in one of his books, he describes a key moment of waking up for him, a moment I call radical acceptance. He says he had spent decades and decades really depressed and anxious and selfish, and the worst part of it, he felt despairing about how to change, and the worst part of it was that even his friends kept telling him that he really needed to become less self-absorbed. And so finally one day his world was kind of stopped when one of his friends said, don't change. I love you just the way you are. Don't change. I love you just as you are. And he said that the words were like pure grace. They just flooded through them. And he said, paradoxically, it was only when he got permission not to change, to be just as he was, that he actually transformed in a profound way. And to me, that describes one of the deep principles of healing and transformation, which is it's only when we stop the war, stop the accusation towards ourselves that we're bad and wrong as we are, that we actually are free to flower, free to become all that we can be. So for him, it was fortunate that he had a friend help him, and many of us have friends that are mirrors in a positive way. But ultimately, for us to really move forward on our path, we need to be able to give ourselves the message of care, of deep love and acceptance in the moment to open the door to change. So tonight's talk is titled The Reign of Self-Compassion. And many of you are familiar with the acronym RAIN, and I'll be going into it some. The way I'll be sharing it tonight is slightly different than many people are familiar with it from the last decades. And it's a practice and a way of deepening in self-compassion that I've gotten a lot of feedback has been really helpful to people. So I wanted to share this practice, the reign of self-compassion, and some of the context for it. And if it's something you find helpful, I've written out a document on it that you can find on my website. If it helps you to have something written out, just go to tarabrach.com/self-compassion, all one word. So, I've probably talked more about the suffering of self-aversion and the need for self-compassion than any other single theme that I come back to regularly. And the reason is that it's so pervasive, a suffering. And also I'm so familiar with it. It's like as much as I talk about it, I keep having to recognize, back at war with myself again. And I need to be kind over and over again. So I feel like it's worth coming back to. And I've noticed that even when it's other emotions that are prevalent, even though for you it might feel like, no, it's anger, or it's fear, or it's, jealousy, or judgment, deep down, there's a sense of something's wrong with me. If you look closely, whatever difficult emotion is going on, it's not just that emotion. It's not just the fear or the jealousy. There's also another feeling, which is I'm bad for having this feeling. This feeling reflects badly on me. I feel bad, I am bad. They seem to go together. And in the Buddhist tradition, this is described as second arrowing, that the first arrow is the feeling of fear, and the second arrow is the feeling of I'm bad for feeling this fear. So rather than the first arrow is fear, rather than bringing healing energy to the fear, instead we lock in the trance by saying this is bad or this is wrong. So I got an email last week. A woman said, Dear Tara, my 12-year-old niece is quick to worry and often gets wound up with anxiety. After one such experience, she and I left to run some errands. She started apologizing in the car and expressed how badly she feels as she has panic attacks. The second arrow. I explained the concept and then offered what seemed like a year's worth of Dharma talks into 15 minutes. So focus on the breath, bring yourself to the present. The feelings are real, but the story you're believing is not. Bring compassion and kindness to yourself. She mentioned again about feeling bad for having gotten so worked up, and I said something like, yeah, the second arrow can be really difficult. And she said, yeah, and then there's the third arrow when you realize that what you're worried about isn't even true. You know? So these stories we have of personal deficiency, of badness, are the most sticky of all the beliefs. They're the ones that are really hard to wake up out of. And by the way, many people will say, yeah, but I actually go around feeling kind of like I'm special and better than other people and superior. And what I've noticed is that that swelling of inflation is totally true. We tend to be bulimic. We either feel like we're the worst or we feel special and important. We kind of go back and forth. But underneath that specialness is a real hollow feeling and a feeling of separateness. It's a very fragile kind of superiority, and deep down there's a lot of vulnerability. Feeling unlovable and feeling unworthy is a trance. It's one of the common pervasive forms of trance that we go into. And when I talk about trance, I'm talking about a narrow, distorted reality that we are living in for just a time. And for instance, we know how much we judge ourselves. I've done many hand raises and said, how many of you think you judge yourself too much? And mostly it's 99%, you know. But what we're not aware of is how many life moments are squeezed by an undercurrent of not enough, should be doing more, something's wrong. There's some sense of a problem, and the problem is me. That's an undercurrent. And I often think of it like a fish in water, that it's so familiar that we don't even realize that we're breathing in that kind of toxicity of not okay. So many people wonder, well, why is this kind of insecurity about self so pervasive? I mean, how come so many of us deep down feel like, you know, we're not okay? And we can see it as a kind of mirror to the larger culture, that there's so much striving and so much competition and so much bias and fear. And for most of us, rather than the assumption of belonging, the assumption that we are acceptable and lovable, we have to meet certain standards. And they're in the culture and they're in our family life growing up, that we have to be a certain way, we have to look a certain way and act a certain way and succeed to a certain degree in order to have some confidence, at least for the moment, that we're okay. And the standards, of course, are in a society are set by the dominant culture. So if we don't belong to the dominant culture, there's even more hurdles. You know, if we're of a different race than white, you know, more hurdles. If we don't fit into the dominant culture in terms of religion, right now being Muslim, more hurdles. Deepens the trance. And then underneath all those standards that we need to make, there's a basic negativity bias in just existing, that we tend to remember the things we did wrong. And it's part of surviving that, you know, in the old days when there might be a lion around the corner, it was really worthwhile being vigilant and thinking something was going to go wrong in any moment. You know, it helped to have a nervous system, right? But now, for us to always be fixating on any mistake we've made so we don't make it again, just makes us more nervous and anxious about making mistakes. It kind of locks us in. So there's a lot of research that shows how our minds are designed to remember what's wrong and to get then anxious and then make more mistakes. I have a really early memory of it where I was maybe 6 or 7 years old and my parents had taken me to a restaurant and the waiter was chatting me up and he said something like, well, you look like a smart young lady. And of course, then I needed to prove I was smart. So he says, I have a question for you. What color was George Washington's white horse? So I just, my brow got furrowed and I really started thinking about it. And I went through everything I remembered from, any stories I'd ever heard about George Washington's horse and so on. I tried to remember if I'd seen pictures of the first president. I finally made my best guess, which was black. True story, So, anyway, failure and shame get entrained. There's this mess. It's like the brain knows, let's remember this so we don't do it again. So we can look back in our memory banks, and that's what will jump out to us. One physician described it happening to him. He says, as a new young MD and doing his residency in obstetrics, I was quite embarrassed when performing a female pelvic exam. To my embarrassment, I had unconsciously formed a habit of whistling softly. The middle-aged lady upon whom I was performing this exam suddenly burst out laughing and further embarrassing me. I looked up from my work and sheepishly said, oh, I'm sorry, was I tickling you? And she replied, and she had tears running down her cheeks from laughing so hard, no, doctor, but the song you were whistling was, I wish I was an Oscar Mayer wiener. He wouldn't submit his name. So we remember. The trance of unworthy, as I mentioned, in the moments we're in trance, when we're thinking something's wrong, our attention's narrowed, and we're focused specifically on the beliefs and feelings of what's wrong. So we're forgetting a larger reality. Now, you might consider for yourself what's really happening, like if you really start investigating trance, because the only way to wake up out of the trance is to literally shine the light of awareness on it. So I want to do that just for the next few minutes. Just look at, well, what is really going on when you, for instance, when you're defensive with a colleague, or when you're too harsh in parenting, or when you find you're drinking too much, or you're insensitive to your partner's needs, and then you turn on yourself. And you feel really like, I'm a bad person. What's really going on? In the moments when we sense that that's going on, that we're living in the trance of unworthiness, and we make a kind of U-turn so that instead of blaming ourselves or blaming another or acting out, we turn the light and tenderness of attention right to where the rawness is. And that's what we're going to explore next, is how do we really bring a quality of presence that can heal us to the moment. And we'll use, as we have in the past, the acronym RAIN, and as I've mentioned, a slightly changed version to explore this. And the way the acronym goes is this, that you recognize and allow that you're in a trance. Okay, you go, okay, I'm judging, and the signs are this. You might notice you're judging yourself. So that's the big one. Usually there's that voice of the inner critic going on. But you also might notice that you're justifying yourself. You're rehearsing what you're going to say to somebody else. Or you might know that you're overeating or over-drinking. Or you might notice that you're speeding up and worrying. There may be a lot of different reasons, but you stop and go, okay, in some way I'm not feeling good about myself. Recognize it and just allow it. We just let it be there, because you can't begin to deepen presence, make that U-turn, if you keep behaving. You need to pause. Okay? The I, which is investigate, and we investigate with curiosity, with gentleness. We investigate by asking, what's really going on inside me right now? Again, this is the same rain you're familiar with. We investigate with the eye by sensing, well, where do I feel it? And what does it feel like? Maybe what am I believing? What does this place most need? This place that's feeling so inferior, so bad. That's the I. And the N is to then nourish with compassion. Nourish with compassion. There's a little poem someone sent after they did the self-compassion practice. Terms of endearment help. They pad the burden even when we cannot breathe through our most menacing demons. Something simple as, "It's okay, sweetheart, just may save." We nourish with the N of rain. After rain, after recognizing, allowing, investigating, and nourish, we just simply rest and notice, okay, what's it like right now? And what we'll discover is, at the beginning of rain, we were in the trance of unworthiness, a small self that felt deficient. After the rain, after we've nourished, we'll discover the sense of who we are is enlarged. Rest as that. Notice what you are and rest in it. That largeness, more spaciousness, more tenderness. Let me give you an example of how the rain of self-compassion works, and we'll practice together. So in this example, I was working with a minister who had reached an impasse in his marriage, and his wife was really dissatisfied. She wanted him to be more intimate, more vulnerable, more real with his feelings, not so spiritually detached. He wanted her to look her in her eyes and say, "I love you," and let her know when he was scared, really feel more connected. And the more she asked that, the more he felt blocked, stuck, and offended. So we worked together, and he got in touch with under that block. Whenever he felt blocked and defended and cut off, he felt a real sense of deficiency, and there was a real harsh inner critic who basically said, "You're a hypocrite." In other words, his critic was saying, "You're preaching love, but you don't embody it," that kind of thing. His inner critic would say, "You can comfort and guide as a spiritual advisor. You're fine with people as long as you're in the role of the minister, but as soon as you're peers, you can't be close." His critic would say, all your life you've never been close to anybody. So there was a lot of shame. So his practice with rain was to recognize and allow when that trance state would come, where he'd feel like he was being asked to be intimate, but he couldn't because he felt fundamentally like something was wrong with him. He just couldn't show up. Then when we worked together, we started investigating, and when I'd say, "Well, what does that shame place feel like?" He said, "It's a sinking, hollow ache, and I can feel it in my heart and in my belly." And I'd say, "What's the belief going on? I'm an imposter, and I'm defective, and people will find out." Mostly it was his wife. He felt like he couldn't be real because she'd find out that he was defective. And then when I'd ask, "Well, what does that hollow shame place most need?" He said it needs forgiveness, it needs love, it needs somebody, a presence that sees my goodness. So that was the investigate. And then nourish. Okay, now when we nourish, in some way we want to bring love, compassion to that place. And I often put my hands on my heart, because I have found, and so many have found, that touch really makes a difference, and research is showing it too. There's a whole nexus, a neural nexus in this area. If we touch our heart, it helps, it brings a kind of warmth and a contact. It actually arouses the parasympathetic and decreases the sympathetic, which is calming and soothing. But nourish can happen through words, through a message, through imagining energy. For him, he was in sense calling on God's love and his own love and trying to send it in. He said he just tried to let it pour into his chest and into his belly. And he had a sense of saying, it's okay, you can just surrender into love. It's okay, surrender. So that was rain. He recognized and he allowed, he investigated, he found out where it was living, he nourished. Post-rain, and this is really important, in the moments after nourishing, to sense, oh, so what's this like? He felt a kind of spaciousness. He felt a vibrating, loving awareness that felt spacious. And that's where there's a shift in identity. And by the way, the shift in identity is really the signature of freedom. When we're in the trance of unworthiness, our identity is small and deficient. After rain, when we check, when we've really nourished, there's a sense of spaciousness and tenderness and no solid self-centered self. There's just an open presence. And this is what he discovered. He had to do it many, many rounds because, of course, all the old feelings and beliefs would keep coming back. So many rounds of bringing his, kind of hands to his heart and calling on God's love and his own love and pouring it inward and then sensing a larger sense of being. Months later, shared that for the first time in 26 years, he said he and his wife were feeling each other's hearts. Came from repeated self-compassion. This is a poem from Rumi that he liked, so I thought I'd share it. Very little grows on jagged rock. Be ground, be crumbled, so wildflowers will come up where you are. You've been stony for too many years. Try something different. Surrender. So for this minister, the trance was actually this kind of, there was an inner stoniness where he played his role, but he was just armored against that fear. And by rain dissolved that stoniness. And the wildflowers were that he could really love from a much more free and open place. And this is one of the gifts of the rain of self-compassion, which is that if you practice it, and it's like any other practice, you have to do it over and over because the conditioning is strong to regard ourselves as a self that's deficient and doesn't deserve it. So it takes over and over again, even if you're just going through the motions. The language is neurons that fire together, wire together. And to decondition that over and over, recognizing, allowing, investigating, nourishing. But each time you do it, pause after the rain practice, because the true flourishing of or flowering of the practice, remember Rumi's poem, the wildflowers are right after the rain. After the rain, just rest and discover who you are when there's no longer a war going on. That's the question. Who am I when I'm absolutely allowing and caring for the life that's right here?